Hello, everyone. Welcome to Equals. This is Naf.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening in. This is Annie. Welcome to Equals.
I'm really excited to be co hosting today's episode with my colleague Annie, who is our media lead on inequality at Oxfam. Really great having you with me, Annie.
Yes, thanks, Nav. I will definitely do my best. I'm usually behind the camera or behind the mic, not in front of it. So excited. I'm sure this will be fun.
No, I'm really, honestly, I'm really excited to be doing this with you. It's going to be an amazing season. So, Annie, how did it go at Rio at the G20?
Actually, quite well. We're really pleased. Brazil using their G20 presidency to respond to people's demands worldwide to tackle extreme inequality, hunger, climate breakdown, but especially for rallying action on taxing the super rich.
I have to say, Annie, that was incredible. Really, like when the G20 said they're going to endorse taxing the richest, it was just like an incredible outcome. I'm following this with colleagues from the COP29 line. And I wish, at the G20, they said more about the trillions needed for climate finance, because that pressure is needed at COP29 for COP29 to deliver, the trillions we've been calling for this whole year.
Yes, definitely. And the ball is in South Africa's court now to continue the fight against inequality and make this year's agreement to tax the world's super rich a reality. That would truly be a historic legacy of their forthcoming G20 presidency. So, fingers crossed. Hopefully, this happens.
I agreed. I think we can achieve further with South Africa, G20 presidency. And talking about South Africa, today's topic will be focused on inequality in South Africa.
Yes, that's right. We have Isobel Frye joining us. She's a lawyer and an activist, and she's the executive director of the Social Policy Institute in South Africa. Shall we get started?
Yes, looking forward to our discussion.
Great.
Isobel, great having you on our Equals podcast and really look forward to a discussion on inequality in South Africa. Can you tell us a bit about your personal journey? What sparked your commitment to advocating for equality and justice in South Africa?
Absolutely, and thanks so much, Nav, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I don't know how much you are aware of South Africa, but we will talk about apartheid, but also South Africa currently is the most unequal country in the world, and that's both in terms of income and wealth, and so it's a good country to be talking about. But just about my personal journeys, I grew up white under apartheid, but as an Anglican priest's kid, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was my dad's boss, my dad's earthly boss, should we say. So at home, our values were very different to those of the apartheid state. And this often brought me as a young child into sort of strange positions that I didn't quite understand. I remember when I was about 10, my dad asked me to go in the car. He was taking a woman parishioner home that he'd been counseling. I had my bath, I was in my pajamas, and I couldn't understand why he would call me out to go with him. It was just down the road. And he tried to explain to a 10-year-old the concept of the Immorality Act, which was an apartheid law that prevented a man and a woman across the colour line from being in the same space alone. The assumption was that miscegenation, sex across the colour line had taken place. And it was just really confusing and disturbing to me. I think at school, so my school was a whites only school because all amenities were separated. And the kids would just use really ugly words to talk about my dad's parishioners and our friends. And so there was always a sense of anger that people could be dehumanized. So growing up, just knowing that there was a different reality and it was a horrible reality outside. And what I knew was a much better state of being. And so I think that's where it started. At high school, we tried sort of small conscientizing, educating, mobilizing activities such as wearing red ribbons, usually met with a lot of resistance from people. But I think that was just really who I am. I realized I'm an activist. And again, it was interesting about equality and inequality. So I grew up white, but poor white, sort of church poor. There's a reason there's that saying in English that it's poor as a church mouse. We were poor as church mice. But we had an effective welfare state for white people in terms of education and healthcare. And so we didn't feel the brunt of multidimensional poverty. And for me, after 94, I soon realized that the welfare state notion wasn't being opened up to all. And that was something which really got me quite worried about the future. And then I think just finally, on my personal journey, I studied law in the early 90s, and my desire had been to be a human rights lawyer. And then by the time I graduated, amazingly, we had a new dispensation, a new constitution, and a democratic South Africa. So I started practice in a firm and drifted towards commercial law. But I was starting to build up a pro bono practice because people came knowing that I was a lawyer and came for advice, and I couldn't send them away. And I just got to a point where I realized again that because of the inequalities in this country, law and justice could never equate if the majority of people who really needed help couldn't afford legal assistance. So we're stacked in an unequal arrangement. Really, that's where I moved from commercial litigation into human rights law and into the social justice sector.
Thanks for sharing, Isobel. That was really powerful. I wanted to ask you about apartheid. So it's been 30 years since the end of apartheid, and South Africa is still grappling with its legacy. As you mentioned, the country remains one of the most unequal societies in the world. Can you tell us how racial and economic inequalities continue to intersect in South Africa today?
Apartheid was such an iniquitous system that it's devastating how its legacy continues to mold society in so many ways today. I think just to take people back, pre 94, Black people and people of color were firstly forcibly removed from their lands, and their assets were bulldozed on so many occasions. So what people had built up and accumulated was just destroyed and taken away, and people couldn't rebuild that. So you couldn't own land if you were a person of color. You couldn't accumulate, and Black people were also not allowed to run businesses. So you couldn't have something which you passed down across the generations in terms of economic activity. Education was limited in duration of years, number of years that Black people and people of color attended school, and also in its content. So in essence, Black people were reduced to the unit labor of unskilled work. So it was their physical bodies that they were. So we know that globally, accumulated wealth attracts far higher returns than wage income. I mean, Thomas Piketty and Oxfam says so. So we know from the many reports that there is no even playing field if one person has multi-generational wealth and skills and the other person starts with nothing. I think the other aspects of inequality that are so linked, for instance, are social networks. We know the saying that it's not what you know, but it's who you know. And that's so true. If your parents are lawyers or any middle class professional, you have so much greater ability to access opportunities than if your parents are unemployed, living in a shanty town or a deep rural village where English is not language that people speak. So social mobility is very structured in any given society. And in South Africa, the bridge hasn't been built yet. And privilege is reproduced, and so is lack of privilege. And so you just have that reproduction of inequality, which the state has tried to introduce programs to reduce and to equalize. But I mean, if you look, for instance, at the fact that employment or unemployment, so for the majority of people who don't have access to accumulated wealth, your salary is the way in which you earn income. But if we look, for instance, at the unemployment figures, South Africa's got one of the second highest unemployment rate in the world, and that's at 42.6%. But the stark inequality is that for Black African people, the unemployment rate is 47%. And for whites, it's 9.7%. So it's single digits for whites, and it's almost 50% for Black Africans. I think another way of looking at it is for people who are employed, the last inequality study was 2019, and that shows that Black median individual monthly income was 3,500 Rand per month, whereas for a white person, it was 24,000 Rand per month. And just to give you the example, so 3,500, which was the median Black African salary, it's about 245 US dollars, about 193 pounds, and white median income of 24,000 is about $1,680 or 1,320 pounds. So $245 compared to 1,680. And that's where we are 30 years into democracies.
As you mentioned, Isobel, like this is the legacy of apartheid in terms of, the deep scar it has left. But given that South Africa recently had an election and now there's a new coalition government formed by the African National Congress, the Democratic Alliance, and the Inkatha Freedom Party. So, do you foresee any meaningful shifts, in addressing this huge inequality?
In short, no. I think so. So the new government is known as the Government of National Unity, the GNU as we call it. And really, the compass of the GNU is to the right of what the ANC was. It's much more pro-business, which is really about maintaining vested interests. If we look back at the ANC, it was one of the main liberation movements, and it's always claimed to be social democratic party favoring, they would say, a mixed economy. But I think as time went on, the ruling party, as it was more and more influenced by the neoliberalism of, for instance, the World Bank, the IMF. And so what we began to see was the emergence of an elite of black and white, resting on an underclass of significantly black South Africans. But what we've seen increasingly over the last 30 years is that the social wage, the components of state support, whether that's education, healthcare, social security, which is something we'll talk about, but also housing, that's become smaller and smaller, more and more mean. And 9 years ago, government started talking about the need for austerity budgeting, which is to kind of reduce state expenditure in order to really please the markets. And that's really what we've seen with the new Government of National Unity is great consideration for what pleases the investors, what pleases the market. And so while our population is growing and while poverty and inequality are growing, and you would hope that the state revenues would be used very intentionally to reduce that, we don't see that at all. On the 1st of October, there was a launch of a new program called the Government Business Partnership Phase 2. And it had two priorities, which is privatization of investment in the energy and the transport of freight system. And when it came to the modalities of sharing the growth, which is supposed to come as a result of these interventions, the commitment was to create 1 million jobs over 5 years. And yet currently we're looking at 12.4 million people who don't have a job. So 1 million jobs over 5 years at the cost of the privatization of many services, which will then require user fees, is really a sharp outlining of the extent to which the Government of National Unity has moved to the right of where the ANC was, I believe.
Isobel, you've been a strong advocate for universal basic income in South Africa. And I've read lately that the government has said that they want to transform the COVID-19 grants they had during COVID into a universal basic income to tackle poverty. Now, can you tell us, is this the case? And if so, I'd be curious to know, what do you think about this proposal? Is it enough? Or do we also need more radical reforms to address deep-rooted inequalities in South Africa?
The Constitution of South Africa guarantees to everybody the right to social security, including the right to social assistance. So it's a justiciable constitutional right. So in 2002, there was a committee of inquiry that looked into how to expand the social security system. And that really was forward-looking. It was called for by the Trade Union Federation, COSATU, because they were worried about the trajectory of unemployment and the lack of income. And that recommended a radical introduction of a national social security system, which would have collect contributions from workers and be able to dispense income relief when people were either the usual risk contingencies, so unemployment, but also maternity leave, sickness, disability, and retirement. And modeled on a number of sort of northern industrial democracies, that would be a sort of self-funding. Well, it would collect contributions, and there'd be some state funding. And a basic income was part of the basic income floor. So people who weren't earning would have access to a guaranteed basic income. But at the time, the ANC said that it was an insult to give small amounts of money to poor people and that they would create jobs. But that hasn't happened. As I mentioned earlier, 12.4 million people are not employed, and there is no social assistance. And then fast forward to COVID. As part of the negotiations in South Africa, we had an initial complete lockdown, and I represent civil society on a social dialogue platform known as NEDLAC, the National Economic Development and Labour Council. And I, on behalf of the civil society constituency, tabled a demand that there be income made available for working age people who didn't have other income as part of lockdown. And that really then became the social relief of distress grant, which is incredibly low in amount. It was 350 Rand when it was introduced. It's now 370, which is less than half the food poverty line. But it crossed that invisible line of not giving income to working age people. And many of us had high hopes that this would indeed be the springboard into a much more comprehensive, decent income support. National Treasury has battled against this on every front. And in fact, what the way that the amount and the eligibility is determined is Treasury gives a certain amount, and then Department of Social Development has to juggle the means testing and the targeting criteria so that it fits the budget. So each month, over 15 million people apply for the paltry 370 Rand. And each month, about 8 million people receive it. So there's a significant sort of mismatch there between people who bother to apply for the small amount and those who are awarded it. Within SPI, we've done econometric modeling on what we call the SPI UVI. And that's really a universal, unconditional monthly cash payment to everybody under pension age, because the pension is more of a guarantee, linked to the upper bound poverty line, which is currently 1,634 Rand. And we call it the sweet spot because of the amount of the grant and because it is universal and therefore sort of floods society. It's really an economic stimulus. And we see that as being, you asked about the radical. We believe that because of the stimulus effect that it has, it moves away from poor relief and charitable handouts and really becomes a dynamic stimulus of change in itself. Because if this amount of money were in the hands of every person, clawed back from the middle class, you don't have the stigma of receiving benefits. You don't have the errors of exclusion, which, as I indicated earlier, are multiple. And you don't have to prove every month that you're eligible. And so the idea of a universal basic income, a decent universal basic income, I think is really transformative. Is it enough? No, certainly not. It's not enough to rebuild a failing economy, but it is a start. It means that people become economic agents and are able to work with what they have. I did some interviews with people who were receiving the 350, the COVID grant, and I spoke to an unemployed builder in a northern rural province. And he said as soon as he got the grant, he went to the hardware store and was able to get sort of credit, really, the essentials for building, bricks and cement and things like that. And he started a business with income. But because he started earning, he earned in above the means test, which is very little. And so he lost the grant. And so as soon as he lost the grant, he lost the credit. And so he lost the ability to actually work together with the income. Those are the kinds of things that universalism ensures that we don't run into. it also just enables everybody to be seen as a rights holder in their own.
How do you think the Universal Basic Income project could be funded? And what do you think about a wealth tax in South Africa?
Whenever we present on this, we get asked about how it can be financed, and people ask about tax. And they point out correctly that our tax base is too small to fund the total cost of a universal basic income. I do, however, think that a wealth tax is something which needs to be prioritized in South Africa because of the inequality. I think the wealth tax shouldn't be seen as being the sole funder of a program, but I think that it needs to be a very intentional act to start to reduce the levels of inequality that we have. And it should be done with a political fierceness, which indicates to people that we are tackling inequality very intentionally.
It's incredible, Isobel, to listen to all the challenges facing South Africa. When we thought of speaking to you about South Africa, we wanted to spotlight a country that is taking a leading role in advocating for various global issues, including bringing a case against Israel to the International Court of Justice for its war on Gaza. Because a lot of countries, especially in Africa, are finding this really inspiring. The country is also preparing to take on the G20 presidency. So, what actions would you like to see, from the South African government in the fight against inequality?
It's really exciting for us that South Africa is going to host the G20 next year. And we at SPI, Social Policy Initiative, we've been part of the presidency's development working group task force since the beginning of the year, just thinking and preparing for the G20. And it's been really pleasing. You mentioned we have huge challenges, and I think one of the lessons I've learned in my years is that in every structure you find allies as well as those who are opposed. And the people we've been working with in the presidency have been very open to receiving non-governmental input. We've managed to secure 3 thematics which are really critical in the fight against inequality. The first is looking at financing for development and really trying to ensure that the aid promises are met, but also that in many more ways, more radical steps are taken. And so that was the discussion around the wealth tax, supporting the UN tax initiative. But I mean, one of the things that, and this is not necessarily government, I think this is civil society working as a C20, pressuring the G20, should be doing is looking at debt cancellation as part of tax and debt justice. The second is social protection. And in a workshop last week, we managed to structure a very progressive, well, we like to call it radical, but for the world, we call it progressive agenda, bringing in people globally who are working on universal social protection, moving it from a sort of targeted World Bank idea into a far more dynamic, transformative, universal social protection. And then the third is the matter of global public goods. I mean, for me, it's in the name, right? I mean, public goods should be public goods, whether you come from the global south or the global north. But just reading through some of the past declarations and proceedings rather than declarations, where you have countries from the global north being very protective about sharing issues such as vaccinations, intellectual property. And I think we need to just be really, really explicit about the fact that pandemics don't respect borders, and neither do migrants. If the global north is concerned, as it constantly is, about migrants, then maybe they should look at improving the livelihoods and lives of people in countries from where migrants leave. But I do think that the C20 and the working groups outside of government, the civil society, labor, women's group, youth group, Y20 needs to really be proactive in terms of putting pressure on our government. Our government is very conscious of the fact that this is the last presidency for a while that will be presided over by a global South country. But what I've learned is also governments don't want to ask for commitments that are not going to be met. So there is a risk where governments ask for less in order to ensure that their asks become the declarations. So, yeah, we'll be working very hard alongside collegiate comrades and allies in government to assist where we can.
Really looking forward to that, Isobel. You know, all three areas you mentioned, the global goods, the social protection, the tax justice, is also something Oxfam and allies are pushing for, especially on the tax justice front. So, you know, as you said, if all civil society can also come together and put pressure on governments, then maybe governments can step up and also push for an ambitious outcome.
Isabel, to wrap up our discussion today, I'd like to ask you one more question. Given South Africa's complex and often painful history, could you share with us, with our listeners, what is it that gives you hope? What is it that sustains your commitment to fighting for equality?
To be honest, on some days it is difficult. But for me, really, it is working with a collective because an individual can do a certain amount. But if you're wanting change, the collective not only is important because you share the burden, but it has an energy of its own, and it refreshes and renews and reinvigorates. For me, what can be frustrating because we do the research, and then I've learned this 20 years ago. You put forward a suggestion, a policy suggestion, and you get told by the policymakers that you haven't looked at X. And so you spend a lot of time, you raise finances so that you can research X, and you put that answer forward. And then they turn around and they give you something completely different. So knowledge is really important, research and data, and that's really what we do at SPY is critical. But you have to have the political force. You have to have mobilized progressive movements. And so that is the point. And there have been many occasions when I've been despondent and people have just reached out. And likewise, I think, again, more personal is I have an 18-year-old daughter, and I really want her world to have a future, a great future, a good future. And the victories, we do have victories. And I know that within civil society, we want to change the world. And so if we change a small thing, we don't recognize that. I've just been looking at the 18 years of my organization and really putting together a timeline and realizing that there were so many things that with hindsight, we should have really celebrated. I think that we need to be much kinder to ourselves and our efforts in our celebrations of our successes, because that's what also gives us renewal.
Yeah, it's been incredible talking to you, Isabel. Truly inspiring. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, what you're saying about the collectivity and also how we're hard on ourselves a lot of the time. I was talking to a colleague about that just yesterday, and we say we're hard on ourselves, and I do agree with you that we should celebrate victories, even the small ones, and also our allies' victories. Yeah, completely agree.
That was such a great discussion with Isabel, Annie. I'm really happy that we finally got to deep dive into inequality in South Africa in this episode. But, you know, Annie, I was actually thinking, I've always been hesitant about visiting South Africa. And I think it's because of the legacy of apartheid. It hangs so heavily, no? And it's hard to move past that history.
Yeah, I completely understand that.
But you know, today talking to Isabel, it made me realize how South Africa has such a vibrant civil society. There's so much activism, you know, there's so much debate, and also progress being made despite the painful past, but also, you know, despite all the challenges that they're faced with.
Yeah, that's true. And it was such a significant move when South Africa brought a case against Israel to the International Court of Justice for its war on Gaza.
Absolutely, Yanni. South Africa is also leveraging its experience with injustice to call out other injustices today.
Yeah, yeah. And that reminds me of Isabel when she was sharing her story about growing up during apartheid, how her family was poor. But
Hmm.
because she was white, contrary to black South Africans, she had access to an effective welfare state. She had access to public education, public health care. And that part really resonated with me. She became a lawyer and she's doing the work that she does now. And I do think that I am where I am because I went to public school, because I had access to public health care. My sister and I went to public university while neither of my parents finished high school, and they
Mm,
grew up in rural poverty. And that's the kind of story that public goods make possible. They really do break down barriers and reduce inequality.
agreed, Annie. That's actually such a great story. And also, a reminder that when we invest in public services, we invest in people, no? And that can have such a lasting impact on society as a whole.
Indeed. Couldn't say it better. So, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and do make sure to tune in for our next episode.
Get in touch with us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and also please do recommend this and give us a good review. And we'll talk to you next time. Cheers, everyone.
Bye.